Is the Ottawa Alberta Memorandum of Understanding good politics or bad politics? David Coletto from Abacus Data is bringing some receipts today. We'll talk about that, as well as turmoil in conservative politics in British Columbia, Great Britain, and elsewhere. As always, I'm grateful to be joined by Amanda Galbraith, a co-founder and principal at Oyster Group, and David Coletto, the co-founder and chair of Abacus Data. David and Amanda, always great to talk with you.
Hi, all.
Hello.
So, guys, in the immediate aftermath of Prime Minister Carney and Alberta Premier Danielle Smith's announcement of this memorandum of understanding on, amongst other issues, a possible pipeline to the West Coast, there was an initial reaction that this looked to be good politics. It's rare to have the Prime Minister and the Alberta Premier standing together, smiling, heralding this significant federal provincial agreement. But then in the days that followed, we had a resignation from Stephen Guilbeault. We had Alberta Premier Danielle Smith receive some jeers at the United Conservative Party AGM over the weekend. And I must admit, I myself was left confused about how to think about the politics of this. David, you've been in the field, so rather than hypothesizing, why don't you level set for our listeners and viewers? How are Canadians in general, and perhaps more importantly, or as importantly, Albertans and Conservatives thinking about this deal?
So let's start with the proviso that this is a first snapshot, and I think we should talk about the longer term politics of this, depending on how people engage and who fights and who amplifies the positives of a deal like this. But the initial reaction is overwhelmingly positive. First of all, within a few days, close to 6 in 10 Canadians were aware of the MOU, which I think is pretty high for something like this. Just to give you context, the budget hit 75%. So it's lower than that, but that was an event that had been set up for months. And this we kind of heard about in the last week before it. And so there wasn't a lot of lead time. When you ask people's their initial reaction to it, you get over half of Canadians saying they either strongly or somewhat support it. Only about 1 in 5 oppose it, and the rest say, "Look, I'm not sure," or "I don't really have strong feelings either way." And when you dig into the subgroups here, and on our website, there's lots of data looking at this. A few things stand out. This was a decision and a deal in which Conservatives, those who voted Conservative, are more likely to like it than Liberals, which I can't think of a thing that a Liberal government in the last 10 years has done in which that would be the case. But that's the case on this issue. But even among Liberals, only about 1 in 5 say, "Look, I don't like this," or "I have a negative reaction to it." A majority of even Liberal supporters think this is a good thing, as do a plurality of people living in British Columbia, Quebec, Ontario, like everything. There's a regional kind of consensus. A little more friction in British Columbia, a little more friction in Quebec, but not to the extent that this would be unpopular in either of those provinces. Finally, where the politics becomes probably most acute is not in how Albertans are reacting to this, because they overwhelmingly support it. Danielle Smith's personal numbers in Alberta, are holding. There doesn't appear to be broad reaction. No real booing, except maybe at her convention to this deal with the broader public. But it's in British Columbia, where even though a majority of British Columbians said, "I like the idea of a pipeline to the West Coast," it's within David Eby's own coalition that you start to see the real fracture lines, where about half say they like it and half say they don't. Almost all of those who would support the BC Conservatives say this is a great deal. So that is where you start to see the political lines be drawn. And if you're the Carney Liberals right now, you look at this initial reaction to it and say, "Look, we're kind of won this," because yes, there's some in our own coalition that aren't that happy about it, but they're a minority group. And even if we've lost Stephen Guilbeault from our cabinet, maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it signals to the other parts of the country that our agenda to make Canada an energy superpower is actually a real thing and something we're going to keep pushing towards. So, the initial reaction, I think, was positive, and there's not a lot of friction points in the data that suggests this could go off rails, but you never know.
Amanda, you're such a skilled political strategist and communicator. I want to put to you something that Andrew Coyne wrote in the Globe and Mail in the past couple of days, because I wonder if it captures, in a way, what David just set out. Coyne writes, quote, essentially both Mr. Carney and Ms. Smith have, in their different ways, made the same bet. There are more votes to be gained in the middle ground than there are to be lost on the fringes, unquote. Is that a useful way to think about the politics of this, roughly a week or so after the deal was announced?
I think I think it's broadly probably the right frame, although I would probably argue on the liberal side, I don't know if it's the fringes for them so much as, the Trudeau government of the last decade is
Yes.
like spent, I mean, I know he bought a pipeline, but like the broad spectrum of his BC caucus is not happy with him right now. So to me, that's a little different than Danielle Smith being booed at, or not booed, but getting some jeers at her convention. But I think it speaks to like both leaders looking over, like speaking over their base, speaking over their parties, speaking over their MPs or their MLAs, and saying this is where we think public opinion, and they will have to drag their party along with them, and they will have to hold that consensus together. Because I think as David points out rightly, I think most people very much support this. I think we want something built. This is an actionable big project, again, as opposed to projects that have been already been underway for decades that now more bureaucrats are
Yes.
looking at. And perhaps, so I think this is like a big substantive thing that he is doing, and he needs to deliver on something big and substantive. And part of that, yeah, is going to be challenging to drive through his government. And we know one of the biggest issues with the federal government thus far on the Carney administration is they just don't seem to want to consult with anybody. And then that is the, like, pilot projects are the death of me, and infrastructure in Toronto. But like the BC, and we can talk about, I know, the BC First Nations issues, but like we had the vote from um I think the AFN this week, but unanimously said they're opposed to this. Now, are all members, all First Nations actually opposed to a pipeline? No, but they're standing in solidarity together because they don't feel like they're being meaningfully consulted. So I think the politics of this with Canadians more writ large is a winner for both of them. But I think the politics internally for both of their parties is
Mm.
inherently incredibly complicated, very fragile, is holding because public opinion is on their side. But my guess is that, and David could speak to this, that public opinion around a pipeline going forward, as we saw in the past when these projects, very similar project, tried to get across the line, inevitably frays the longer it goes. And I think that is a real issue in the long run for both leaders.
Guys, I promise we'll get to the dynamic nature of the politics here. It's a good point from both of you, as well as some of the unique particularities in subsets of the different parties' coalitions. But I just want to stay on a moment on Amanda's point about going over their bases and going over their, even in some cases, their elected officials, on the assumption that there is a critical mass of people kind of in and around the median voter who will like this overall package. The reason why I'm drawn to that idea is because it feels like for a long time, our politicians haven't done that. That given the nature of our electoral system, given the kind of political zeitgeist, there's been a tendency on the part of different political leaders in different parts of the country to essentially govern on behalf of their loudest and most galvanized base voters, and in so doing, underestimate the support in the middle for reasonable, pragmatic agenda, but one really focused on the economy and focused on development. And so talk a bit more, David, about this bet that both leaders recognize that it may in a way tweak members of their core base, Guilbeault in a way personifying that, and maybe some of these Alberta separatist types personifying that on the Smith side, but just having the confidence that my dad in Thunder Bay and your dad in Richmond Hill and Amanda, your family in Windsor, who don't, whose political identities are not kind of core to how they see the world and think about the world, would hear something like this and say, that on balance, that strikes me as a reasonable set of ideas or proposals.
Yeah, and I think it is I think a really good example of this happening where the public again I think has been ahead of some of the policymakers and on an issue like economic growth at a time when the country in every part of the region, frankly, feels deeply vulnerable to the forces and the changes being initiated by what's going on in the United States, means that this is the most salient issue. This is the thing that matters. And I think you have the political space to do that, right? So yes, Mark Carney is going to get and has probably got an immense amount of pushback. I mean, you saw it in the convoluted way that different members of parliament in the Liberal caucus were trying to explain what this MOU was and wasn't, right? I think that was on display very much over the weekend and into this week. And that, I think, is a signal that, to Amanda's point, he really probably didn't consult all that much or give much notice to his caucus that what was in this MOU and that it might what it might contain. And the result is this kind of confusion, which I think is risky for Carney, in the same way that his insistence on driving this project forward is a plus, if he is seen perhaps as being pulled back by special interests or minority perspectives. And not to say that Indigenous support for this isn't necessarily something the public doesn't support. It's one of the areas where in our research we do see that if this doesn't get buy-in by Indigenous communities, the public is going to be less comfortable moving this forward. But that doesn't also mean that politics shouldn't get in the way. And this is really important, right? We talked about this multiple times on this podcast. It's a politics podcast, but too often the public looks at big decisions like this or looks at events and is turned off by what they perceive as it being driven by politics as opposed to what's in the best interest of the country. And I think what both Danielle Smith and Mark Carney have basically signaled is, at least on this issue, they are willing to put politics aside, even if it is politically popular. The politics internally complicates it. And I think he needs to recognize that he's going to get kudos for that, the Prime Minister, and keep pushing forward on that.
Amanda?
Yeah, I totally agree. And by the way, what else does Danielle Smith have to deliver for her base to calm down? I mean, like what she got out of the federal government in that agreement was like substantive, like getting rid of the tanker ban at the expense of, I mean, maybe Prime Minister Carney's happy that he lost. He doesn't have to deal with sort of the ringleader of the, nascent environmental caucus within his government, but like holy moly, for them to kind of jeer her there, I think to me is just speaks to, I think, the challenges that she faces with that, really, and many premiers have faced in Alberta, right, around that. And also I think we should talk about the one leader that isn't actually looking at what's greater for the country right now on this issue, and it is David Eby, who is singularly focused on his own base, his own electoral prospects, to my mind, at the expense of the country as a whole. And, yes, I think there is definitely work to be done around the Indigenous piece. Like, for sure, that is very apparent and very clear. And I think, we saw also Minister Hodgson get himself into trouble around, well, I don't have to meet, I can Zoom. And I'm like, which, like, fair enough, sir, but probably not. The coastal First Nations. So I just, I'm for one, like, I'm happy and grateful that we've seen Prime Minister Carney and Danielle Smith come together and sort of, I think, to your point, Sean, like a unique moment in Canada where they're actually saying, hey, this is good for the country. It's tough for internal politics for us, but we think we're going to bet in the long run, one, we'll get benefits from it. But it's also, like, for once, the right thing to do, which is, I think, kind of nice to debate on this politics as opposed to, hey, it gets them this vote and this riding, and there's some of that, but it's the right thing to do. And hopefully, we didn't get success with very similar projects before, but hopefully we as a country, given the impetus, given the pressures from the US, we can actually make this work.
We'll before we wrap up this segment, David, we'll take up your point about how the risk is that public opinion changes as this project becomes transitions from a kind of concept to a particular one. But before we do, I just want to ask about the challenge for Pierre Poilievre and the Conservatives. On one hand, their instinct is to oppose the government in Ottawa. On the other hand, this is a deal that Danielle Smith is heralding, understandably, as a major win for the province. And I can't help but think she's keeping an eye on Poilievre and the Conservatives to make sure that they're not too critical, because, of course, the audience for that criticism is are people in Smith's own base. So why don't you both reflect on how Poilievre and the Conservatives have responded, and the challenge for them in balancing, on one hand, their instinct to prosecute a case against the Carney government, and on the same token, not straying or not diverging too much from Smith and their provincial cousins in Alberta.
Well, maybe I'll start. I think my take on their position is like, yeah, we'll see it. We'll believe it when we see it, as kind of reaction, because they're not going to come out and say, I don't think this idea is a good one, or we shouldn't be building a pipeline. In fact, Pierre Poilievre should take again credit for something that he, in very much a significant way, set the ground for in the lead up to the election and during it, when he made building a pipeline sort of core to his argument. I remember during the leaders' debate, in terms of how important that was to his framing. So I do think it is a complicated place for him. As I said, this is an issue and a deal in which more conservative supporters like than liberal ones. So you have to be careful that you don't, extinguish that and demonstrate that you're just here to oppose as opposed to be constructive. But I also think, Sean, there's another interesting point that comes out that taking off a little bit in a different direction is the opportunity also for the Conservative Party to be seen as somewhat more credible on climate issues, right? In our polling we saw majority of Canadians say, look, it is possible to build a pipeline and meet our climate targets. It's possible to be a global energy leader and achieve our climate goals, right? That is a position that the Liberal under Justin Trudeau would never really admit to, at least not an energy power that includes an oil and gas sector that's growing. So, I do see also an opportunity on how does the Conservative Party position itself even to not that climate is the most salient issue, but this is an opportunity to ride a little bit and say, here we go. We've been saying this maybe for over 2 decades, and now Mark Carney has come along and proven our point for us. So I think there's opportunities to not get upset about this or say, this is a 180 flip on Mark Carney's point, but simply this is how we've been positioned from day one. We've been consistent on this, and therefore you can trust us, do the same kinds of things if we were to take power in the future.
What do you think, Amanda?
I mean, I think it's a tough spot for them, to be honest, because I think the I told you so political campaign, as we've talked about before, is not a winner for them, right? And, we were saying, I think David's point's probably like the easiest way to comment on this without opposing it, which is like, we've been here all along, like, welcome aboard, Prime Minister Carney. But is that of any news value? Like, is that going to be top of the headlines? Is that no? But I think this might be an issue where time is their friend to a certain extent, which is you kind of make some more noises of like, yeah, we were here all along. Great to see the Liberal Party basically rip our entire campaign and governing plan and implement it over the course of the last 6 months. But we also know that as this proceeds, it will be delayed and it will take time and people will get frustrated and things will go not perfectly or not even correctly. And I think there's places there for the Conservatives to push things along, particularly if the government lapses into like performative milestones, which aren't actually moving this project forward as they are often want to do. So but I do continue to see it. I mean, it's a tough place. Like the Prime Minister is really hemming Pierre Poilievre in, and certainly Danielle Smith is doing him no favors by becoming Prime Minister Carney's new best friend. But them's the breaks, man, in politics. Like, what are you gonna do?
Indeed. As we wrap up the segment, David, just talk a bit about the dynamic aspects here. What are the risks to public opinion as this project starts to unfold?
Well, one is, of the close to more than half of people who say they support this pipeline, about half of that is soft, right? And so it is still persuadable. And so one of the things a smart person in British Columbia noted to me is, well, if the ENGO community, if environmental organizations gear up, if they, invest the kinds of resources they can get access to and put that money in front of British Columbians and maybe Quebecers and Canadians more generally, you could see public opinion shift on this, right? We did this survey before Stephen Guilbeault, appeared on a widely watched television program Sunday evening before he started doing political shows this week. And so we'll see whether that public opinion in Quebec holds as he becomes a more vocal, not opponent of the government, but an opponent of its particular policy direction. So I still think this is the starting point. It's not the end. And there are lots of proof points in the past that the public can be persuaded. You have another summer of intense wildfires that could also leave many people asking, is this the right thing we should be doing? And perhaps the Carney government vulnerable to criticism.
Yeah, well, we'll no doubt continue to follow this issue and how it plays out, as you say, with respect to the EB government in British Columbia, some of the First Nations issues. But a case, as Amanda put it, where we have the Prime Minister and the Premier of Alberta making a bet that this is a kind of positive sum politics is nice to see, and hopefully they're rewarded for it. On the second half of the show, we're going to take up some conversations, David, that you've had in recent days on the other side of the Atlantic. You're speaking to us from London, where British Conservatives are going through a period of breakup similar to the one that played out in Canada in the 1990s. But turmoil is not limited to British conservatism. We're speaking on December 4th at 9 a.m. Eastern time, and it's still not clear to me whether John Rustad is the leader of the British Conservative Party. So, David, why don't we start with reflections on what you heard in London, and then Amanda, I'd love to get your thoughts on what's playing out in British Columbia and what, if anything, we should take from it nationally.
Yeah, I'm in London. I've been meeting with a few pollsters here from different political stripes, trying to get a sense of both, how they see the world of polling going, but more interestingly for me is the politics of the UK. And I was at a dinner last night in which I was invited as a neutral observer from Canada to kind of give a comparative assessment, and a bunch of conservative supporters, two former cabinet ministers, some pollsters were around the table. And what the conversation really centered on was something that we've been seeing in the UK for close to a year, is the rise of Nigel Farage's relatively new Reform Party. And the real drop, not only in the last election over a year ago in the UK of the UK Conservatives, but really the fracturing of the right here in the UK. At the same time, mind you, that the Labour government is as deeply unpopular as a government can be just over a year in office. And really, the lessons that they were asking me about is of, how to bring the Conservative family back together, the risk of this long-term sort of divide between, two Conservative factions with slightly different histories, different even audiences, was really interesting. And I think what we're seeing here in the UK is an understanding that this can't go on, that the lessons both from Canada and other countries is, the longer you let that divorce or that split happen, the harder it is to reconcile. And I think what's driving the forces, at least to have conversations with each other, and that's what I've been told, is just how unpopular the Starmer government is, and the risk that he actually gets replaced like Trudeau was with Carney. So lots of interesting parallels between Canada and the UK, but it also raises some interesting questions that we've noted about the fractures in the UCP in Alberta, what's going on as you talked about in British Columbia. So the biggest question is, how do you keep a Conservative coalition together that does have different factions that are being pulled by both populist kind of anti public policy or policy kinds of directions, and the traditional, more ideological Conservative orientation. And I think the UK right now presents a really interesting case in both how it broke and maybe how it might fix itself and bring it back together pretty quickly.
Amanda, I said that I was going to ask you about Rustad, and I'd welcome to have you weigh in on what's playing out in BC. But before you do, maybe just comment on David's last point there, because it's something I think a lot about, which is to say there's clearly an energy in kind of small p populist parts of Conservative politics more broadly. Part of it is motivated by what's perceived as the kind of hegemonic efforts of progressives to control public institutions. Part of it is generational. It's a rejection of identity politics or wokeism or whatever one characterizes it. Part of it is concern about basic cost of living, and a sense that the system has failed, particularly younger people. So there's this energy playing out that's a crucial part of why conservative politics in different parts of the world is being successful. On the other hand, it's a necessary but probably insufficient source of support. And so, how do conservative politicians, on one hand, speak to that part of conservative world, but not at the expense of reaching the type of people who are supporting the pipeline project, as we were discussing in the last segment?
I think it's a real challenge, right? Holding like a modern conservative coalition together today is just beyond challenge. It's always kind of been fractious, particularly in Canada, for example. But that element, that populist element, is important. It should not be ignored. And I think when it is allowed to sort of run amok to a certain extent, you see what's happening in the US, right? Versus at least here you can look at Pierre Poilievre, who's actually sort of harnessed that part of the movement, kept them broadly on side. Occasionally it runs him afoul of sort of mainstream groupthink, media think, that kind of stuff. And you'll see them also try and do things like bifurcate their audiences, right? We go on really niche podcasts to speak to things, which unfortunately the internet is everywhere, and it may bubble up to mainstream and it may not. But I think it's a challenge for all leaders, I think, because to my view, that sort of wokest, more like left-leaning part of the political system is more established and accepted by mainstream media. That is sort of allowed to play out a little. That coalition is a little easier to manage to me than, this deep dark secret of angry people who don't like the system itself. But part of that system that don't is people under 30 who can't get a break, right? And I actually think that coalition itself is also shifting.
Yeah.
So uh, I do feel like we're in a period of like substantive political realignment right now, and I'm not sure what a conservative party looks like in 5 or 10 years. Like I don't know what that is going to be, and I think we're kind of seeing that play out in different ways in different regions.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's my own view as well that the even the Conservative Party of Canada itself has been transforming in my own lifetime. It's a different party than it was under Brian Mulroney. I would argue it's today a different party than it was under Stephen Harper. That
For sure.
partly reflects coalitional dynamics. It partly reflects, for lack of a better term, as I say, the kind of energy in the populist part of conservative world. Obviously, social media is part of that story, but the evolution of conservative politics in the Anglo-American world is, in my mind, a big part of understanding the dynamics in our present day politics. David, feel free to weigh in on that, but I can't let you guys leave without talking about what's going on in British Columbia. And I'll just put my cards on the table. I'm afraid I'm not informed enough to make a judgment about what Rustad has done that's good or bad, or even a judgment about what's playing out in British Columbia politics more broadly. But one of the most striking aspects of Rustad's leadership for me is in the leadership review that was carried out earlier this year. He received about 70% of the vote. The total number of voters, guys, in that leadership review was 1,200. There are more Hub subscribers in the province of British Columbia
Oh,
than that. And so one gets the sense that they rode this wave partly on Pierre Poilievre's coattails, and in the subsequent months have done nothing to kind of institutionalize the Conservative Party of British Columbia as a durable political vehicle in the province. So in my judgment, one wonders if we're not just seeing the demise of John Rustad, if we're seeing a kind of institutional challenge to the BC Conservative Party more fundamentally. David, weigh in on any of that.
Well, I think you raised the most important factor, which is the rise of this party was not likely because people had an affinity towards John Rustad, including probably what are now members of his own party, but instead a one rejection of BC United, the previous kind of free enterprise coalition, I would say label at the moment, at the time, to one that maybe better reflected the instincts of a lot of British Columbians. And so I just think, again, I don't know a lot about BC politics either, Sean, but I think of what's happening within the federal Conservatives, and I look at what's happening within the BC Conservatives, and you see two very different scenarios, right? Where Mr. Poilievre has kept, for the most part, the party united, and there's a much more durable brand, and the party is very much, I think, energized behind him in the way that the BC Conservatives weren't. John Rustad was like a leader out of convenience. He was an MLA. He, had almost no caucus, and so he became like the default leader, as opposed to the one the party felt passionately about. And I do think this is more of a lesson of leadership, as opposed to the Conservative Party in British Columbia necessarily being in turmoil. But it does need to solve this problem quickly. Otherwise, I think, to what you were alluding to, the party does face a bleak future, because it doesn't take much for a new party to just emerge, and as we've seen in BC, and for people to rally around it if they feel it's the best vehicle to win. So it is a very precarious moment, I think, for the party. And I don't know how John Rustad survives this, even if he says he's still the leader, and his executive and half his caucus says he's not. So
Amanda, final word to you.
I mean, I'm going to declare that I'm a supermodel on this show, and just like John Rustad, we will do this together. I mean, we've seen the movie, right? 20 of his MLAs have signed a letter saying he's out. His, his executive has told him he's out. He's out. He just hasn't gone through the 10 steps of grieving in order to get to the other side. I think the points around like the Pierre Poilievre coattails, the fractious nature of that party, and sort of how we've also seen this in other jurisdictions, right? Where people just kind of get into a wave, and like Bob Rae became Premier of Ontario. And it's like, well, what did we do? Like, how did that happen? So I do not profess to be a BC expert, but I got to say the politics in that province are always a little wild to me, just like Quebec. I find them pretty fascinating. And we actually hosted our Oyster Group 1 year party, a year and a half, 30 or 6 months late because we're so busy. But I totally missed this story until this morning, and I'm like, what's happening? He's the leader. He's now the king of Vancouver Island. Like, I don't know. So my guess is by the time this thing is up, Mr. Rustad hopefully will have seen sense. If not, we're into some fireworks. But I mean, in the next 24 to 48 hours, like, he's done like dinner.
Yeah, you meant as we just wrap up, you mentioned Quebec. Funny, I immediately thought of the experience of Mario Dumont and the ADQ, which similarly caught lightning in a bottle, didn't quite win the election, and then in the aftermath didn't do the types of things necessary to make sure that the ADQ remained a durable part of the Quebec political landscape, and now essentially doesn't exist. One wonders if the biggest mistake that Rusted and his team have made if not learning those lessons. And as you say, maybe by the time this podcast is up, he's out. But that's the consequence, guys, of doing these things in real time. I want to thank both of you, particularly David coming all the way from across the pond. I enjoyed talking to both of you, and I look forward to catching up next week.